I would like to start by acknowledging and paying respects to the original inhabitants of this island, Lutruwita, on whose unceded lands we meet today. Ancestors of these three river valleys, the Litera Marinia, I'm really very sorry about my pronunciation here, the Tairano Tipana and the Panier, lived, created and celebrated their culture for thousands of years prior to colonisation. Their oral histories crisscross the island, along with their travels, mapping their knowledge and custodianship of land, sea and air, the flora, fauna and natural resources which are unique to this spiritual country. We acknowledge generations have fought for and will continue to fight for recognition, for voice, treaty and truth, and their home and for the future of all of us in Tasmania. Martin Flanagan, you're all here, so you don't need me to witter on about telling you what an amazing author he is, what a fantastic, rich family he comes from, and how fortunate we are that we have Martin here to share some of his story this morning. Thank you. Please welcome.
Thank you. I want to start by telling a story about my father and something I learnt from him. Dad saw a lot of death and cruelty during the war on the Burma Railway, and I think he spent the rest of his life reflecting on that experience. Then, when he was in his 80s, one of his grandsons, one of my nephews, was diagnosed in his early 20s with schizophrenia. Dad thought that was crueler than anything he'd seen, and it sent him, at that late age, off on a spiritual journey. Not for the first time in his life, he went to that place mystics call the dark side of the moon. When he returned, he told me he had discovered he could speak to the dead. He said to me, God is all the good people that have ever been. So today, before I do a talk like this, I think of all the good people that have ever lived in this place, not just for the last 220 years, but for the thousands and thousands of years that human beings have inhabited this valley. And in that context, I want to say that it's an honour for me that Nick Cameron, the son of Aunty Patsy Cameron, with whom I've just co-written a book called Trouwerner, is here today. Thank you, Nick. I'm going to talk about some of the Aboriginal experiences I had after leaving Tasmania at the age of 30. Growing up down here, very little had made sense to me. I was of Irish convict descent, but what remained of our Irishness was the Catholic Church, which I basically didn't relate to. What had been lost were our stories, our songs, our language, our dances. There was a silence, and feeding into that was a second silence, and that was to do with what happened to the island's Aboriginal population in the first 30 years of white settlement. It's not just that black history in this island is so extreme, so is white history. In 1978, at the age of 23, I went to Ireland thinking I must be Irish. I found I was like them, but I had this other part, which I realised was Australia. I spent 2 years wandering the world and returned to Australia with the feeling that something was still missing. Then I started meeting Aboriginal people, and everything finally started to make sense. For the 35 years I was away from Tasmania between the age of 30 and 65, I took every opportunity, literally, that came my way to spend time with Indigenous people in the city, in the bush, and also in New Guinea. Before I tell you a few of those stories, I want to make a couple of points. The first is this. 2,500 years ago, a Roman playwright we know as Terence said, and I quote, "All that which is human is part of me." I believe that also. I'm interested in Aboriginal history, but I'm interested in all history. Imagine if you were British and you were expected to believe that there was no history in the land before 1770. No Shakespeare, no Stonehenge, no Picts, no Celts, no Romans, no Robin Hood or King Arthur, no Chaucer. Who'd want to live in that state? I like my human history the same way I like my hamburgers, with the lot. And while I'm on this point, can I say that one of the outstanding books I've read in the past year is Lynette Ross's The Story of Launceston's Government Cottage. Nothing has given me a clearer understanding of events in the northern part of this island in the 50 years following white arrival, stroke invasion, and just as importantly, of the attitudes which accompanied those events. The other point I want to make is that I am not an expert on Aboriginal culture. I'm more like a travel writer. Imagine a travel writer who spends 30 odd years travelling in France and develops a love for French cuisine. Does that make the writer French? No. I'm a white fella, but I'm a white fella who spent 30 odd years travelling in Aboriginal Australia. Things are different there, and it's not always easy to tell other white fellas about things you've seen and experienced. For white fellas to get black fella stories, they've got to have curiosity and imagination. The fact is, not everyone has them. The first experience I want to tell you about happened in the late 1980s. There's a very famous Carlton footballer called Sid Jackson, who was a Noongar from the south of West Australia. And I had got to know him, and he said to me, "You've got to get to the big Aboriginal football carnival in the Northern Territory at Yuendamu. It's called the Black Olympics." And it was on the Warlpiri tribal lands, which is 5 hours drive northwest of Alice Springs, in red dirt country. So I got there, I made the drive, and I remember coming into Yuendamu, and I'd previously been in remote Aboriginal communities, but just that shock of seeing people living in humpies, corrugated-iron humpies, and thinking this is Australia. And in those parts of Australia, what Aboriginal people call the law is still strong. And the law is once legal, cultural and spiritual. It's the lot. And when I arrived, pulled up the car, get out, there's a white woman surrounded by these Aboriginal men. And unconsciously, I went to talk to the white person. So I go up and I introduced myself to the white nurse, a woman in her 30s, and we start talking about the carnival. And I said, 32 communities are coming. And she said, 26. I said, 32. I was told in Melbourne 32. And she said, out the corner of her mouth, 26. And what had happened was that the Pitjantjatjara were initiating their young men in the dreaming paths. And where the dreaming paths crossed the roads, it was the roads that closed. And as Ernie Dingo once said to me about Aboriginal law, you never break it twice because the second time you're not here. And the Aboriginal lawman in traditional society is called the Kadachi man. And the word around Yuendamu was the Kadachi man was with the Pitjantjatjara as they were initiating their young men. So I asked the white nurse a third question because I couldn't understand what was going on. And all of a sudden, she's surrounded by Aboriginal men. And in Aboriginal culture, traditional Aboriginal culture, men's business and women's business, two different things. And she just hissed out the corner of her mouth, "It's men's business, don't you understand?" And at that moment, it hit me like a train that I was standing on Aboriginal land. This was an Aboriginal place. And this was a place where Aboriginal culture was strong. And as an experience, I can only liken it to a few years earlier when I was in Egypt, and I was on a train station in Cairo, and I was the only white fella. And I got surrounded by brown people, all staring at me because I was white. And that was the first moment I ever really understood what it means to be in a racial minority. Well, Yuendamu, that was my first time where I really got that I was standing on Aboriginal land. And there was this thing around me that was invisible but had incredible power called the law. So on the second day, the team start playing, and there was a spear throwing contest. And so they've set up this foam spear, and there was a white geologist there, barefoot. I went back to Yuendamu 25 years later, met him again. He said, "I remember you, Richard Flanagan." Anyway, he's standing there in the dirt in his bare feet, and he's writing down the results of the spear throwing. And it was won by a guy, I think his name was Kenny Jackamara. And I'm the well-meaning white reporter. And I go up to this geologist and I said, does Kenny still hunt with the spear? He said to me, "He's not a fucking idiot, mate." He said, "Do you still get round in a cart and horse?" He said, "Kenny shoots him out the back of his Toyota." But anyway, he must have liked me because he invited me that night to a party at his house. And I went along, and no grog, strictly no grog. But there's black fellas and white fellas, traditional Aboriginal men, initiated women. And the geologist is playing jazz on his trumpet. And this little hippie chick hitchhiked out of the desert with a guitar. She came in out of the desert. She was singing Patsy Cline on a guitar. And up against the wall was this Aboriginal man, initiated Aboriginal man with ritual scars roll across his chest. And if you ever check out Thomas Bock's portrait of Manala Gannett, same scars. And he's got an electric guitar and he's playing Jimi Hendrix. And that was another lesson to me. Never, ever, ever, ever assume you know. You never know. And you're talking about two cultures, what? European and Aboriginal culture, they're about as far apart as you can get in human terms. Anyway, on the second, at the end of the second day, Yuendamu had an Asian Aboriginal guy playing, and they were playing Papunya, the closest community, their great rivals. And something racist was said to the Asian Aboriginal guy. He threw a punch, and boom, there's two communities on the ground facing one another with boomerangs and spears. And that took a lot of negotiating. And so as a result, the grand final was late and I missed it. But that was the year the grand final started and the word went through the crowd that the Pitjantjatjara with the Kadachi man had arrived. And the crowd fled, then the players fled, and the ball was left in the middle of the red dirt. That's the fear and the power of traditional Aboriginal law. So that was an early experience for me in terms of getting out of my Whitefella reality and understanding just how different things are in Australia. The next major thing that happened to me was, at that time I was having quite a bit to do with Paul Kelly, the songwriter. And he rang me and he invited me to one of his concerts, and it was at the Victorian Arts Centre, and I think this was 1989. And it was 1,500 people, all white fellas in this auditorium, and there's full of noise, excitement, chatter. And this black man lurches onto the stage with a guitar. Everyone thinks he's American and keeps talking. And he starts singing. And it's one of the most magical experiences of my life, because one by one, the voices in the auditorium go out. And in the end, all you hear is this voice. And it's Archie Roach. And he's singing, "Took the children away." And I thought to myself, I've been waiting all my life to hear this man. And after that, I got to know Archie. And the English poet William Blake said life is about 3 phases: innocence, experience, and what he called organised innocence. And if anyone got that I've known, it was Archie. And I was fortunate to be in the studio in North Carlton the night they put down the final tracks of Charcoal Lane. That was Archie's first album. Undoubtedly one of the great nights of my life. Black fellas, white fellas, few beers, few joints, and the music going really loud, and everyone understanding this is history, something historic has been done here. And when my first novel, Going Away, came out in 1993, I dedicated it to Archie Roach and Bob Brown, and I said, for answering in the affirmative, because they were two people who were taken to the edge. One by the fact that he was gay, grown up in Queensland. The other, Aboriginal, stolen from his parents. And when I gave Archie his copy, he'd read a bit of it. I don't know if he read all of it. But he wrote in the front, to lose yourself, to find yourself, to see yourself anew, that is the journey. So I wrote the first article on Archie that was ever in the mainstream media. There'd previously been a clip of him on a ABC music show called Backroads. And in the course of that, he said something to me that I treasure. And he gave me the confidence to think I could go into Aboriginal Australia and tell stories with Aboriginal people. In fact, the way I worked with Aboriginal people was the same as I worked with white fellas. I'm a lawyer by education. I never exclude evidence. But if I'm going to talk to you about what it was like to grow up on Flinders Island, I'm not going to tell you what it was like to grow up on Flinders Island. I'm going to ask you. And where I don't know, I will read it back to you. And if I have no reason to doubt your testimony, then I'll believe you. And I never exclude evidence to the disadvantage of my subjects, because if you do, your stories will sink at a later date. And I'm serious about what I do, and I want my stories to stand. Another thing that happened to me, this is about 10 to 15 years later, maybe early 2000s. I got contacted by a Melbourne gallery. Two well-known Aboriginal artists were in town. They wanted to see a couple of things in Melbourne. This ended up happening to me a bit. Would I help to show them around? And these were the artists were from Turkey Creek, which is now called Warnham. They were two old Gidja men, Paddy Bedford and Actor Jandine. Paddy was the name of the man whose station Paddy Bedford was born on, a man who had been linked to killings of Aboriginal people. Bedford Names was the name of the station, so he was called Paddy Bedford. Hector Jandine's grandfather, grandmother and father had all been killed by whitefellas. And when you get up north into Northern Australia, the history that happened here in the 1830s happened so much more recently, and you meet it. That first time I went to Yuendamu, the last major massacre in Australia was in the 1927 at Coniston. There were survivors of it still there. The two things these two old Aboriginal people wanted to see in Melbourne were the MCG and where Ned Kelly was hanged. Ned Kelly's a big story in Aboriginal Australia. I once asked an old Aboriginal man, why do you like Ned Kelly so much? He said, because he made the white fella shit himself. Hector Jandine is one of the most spiritual people I think I've ever met. It was like his spirit was scarcely in his body. One of his quotes was, I know right and wrong inside. White fellas read it on paper. In the course of his journey, he'd met the Catholic Church. And his art saw Jesus in the land. We took Hector to the old Melbourne jail and into the condemned cell where Ned Kelly spent his last night. Hector said to me, my mother, she sing me the song he sing the night before he died. That is, there was a Ned Kelly song in the Kimberleys in the 1920s in the Gidja language. The Jarraland people in the Northern Territory have a story that Captain Cook captured Ned, took him back to Melbourne and murdered him. And when you hear thunder, that's Ned's anger. We took Hector to the metal gallows where Ned was hanged, and I looked across and saw tears streaming down his cheeks. Paddy Bedford had been an Aboriginal stockman. Aboriginal stockmen were seriously tough men, like gauchos, and I can tell you stories about that. I was in the Kimberley once with Patrick Dodson on the Bumbra tribal lands, and we were camping with some Aboriginal stockmen, and they all limp because they've all had a horse roll on them. And they make this beautiful tea. They boil the water and they just throw a handful of tea in, and then they'd throw a handful of sugar. Sweet black tea, beautiful. And this day they got up and went out, and one of them said to me, you make the tea. So, oh Jesus. I had to go. They thunder back in on their horses, they jump off, they go over, they pick up the billy, they pour it. This guy drinks it and he spits it out, and I'm on the other side of the fire and it was still going up as it went past me. He said, who made this fucking shit? I didn't like to say I'm really a teabag man myself. Anyway, when I took Paddy Bedford to the scarred tree at the MCG, he put his hand across on the tree, on the scarred tree. There's 2 scarred trees at the MCG. And the Wurundjeri people believe that the MCG is an old Aboriginal dancing ground. Paddy leaned across, put his hand on the trunk of the tree and sang to it. Obviously, I do not know the song, but it was one of those songs. It's one of those songs that come from deep and vibrate. It feels like they're in the land. This was the old scarred tree that's at the top of the hill between Punt Road and the stadium. We sat there for a couple of hours. Time, Whitefella Way, is like a staircase. You do this today and it leads to that tomorrow, and so on. Time, Blackfella Way, as I understand it, is that it's all here now. And eventually sitting with them, my sense of time flipped over and I started to get it. And that was when old Hector Jandine, who was sitting beside me, Blackfella Way, pointed to the ground and said, "People buried here." That old scarred tree is my favourite place in Melbourne. I visited it before every grand final, before every game, and often when no one was playing. I want to tell you some stories now that relate to the dingo. Around 2000, I went to Qvmag, which is the most remote Aboriginal community in Australia. It's on a parallel with Papunya and Yuendamu, but it's on the West Australian side of the border. And it's Pindabi land, Pindabi tribal land. In 1984, a group of 9 Pindabi people that the media called the Pindabi Nine walked in out of the desert. They had not seen white people. They had not seen cars. They had not seen electricity. One of them went back out. And I always found that an intriguing story. You've got this planet with 8 billion people on it who basically say, yeah, we're going that way. And this bloke goes, no, I'm not, I'm going that way. And he goes back out into the desert and lives the traditional way. And I remember being in Alice Springs and being among people who had stories about him and going out into his country and putting up smoke and seeing smoke come back up. Though I did read just the other day that they now think he's dead. But it was an amazing place to be. And one of the Pindabi Nine was still there. And you were told not to look at him. But he ran behind me, young man, beautifully built young man. He jumped into a truck and drove it off. I couldn't get over that. Like, how many thousands of years of knowledge go into making that truck? You know, with the science and the design and petrol and here's this guy coming from this completely different knowledge system. And he probably learned to drive in a couple of hours one afternoon. Anyway, while I was at Qvmag, I met a white woman in her 40s. And she told me this story about her daughter. When her daughter was 4 or 5, she'd wandered off into the desert and got lost. And the white fellas had gone out to try and find her and couldn't find her. So they got one of the old black fellas. By the way, when I use the word black fellas, I only use it because every Aboriginal person I know uses it, and I'm a white fella. I don't mind people calling me a white fella. Anyway, so they got this old black fella, and they took him to where the child was last seen, playing under a tree. And this woman told me how for over an hour, maybe 2 hours, he just walked round and round this tree where all these footprints were. And of course, her child's lost. And, you know, as a white fella, if I would have felt the same, something in me would have been screaming, please, get out there and look. But what he was doing was, there were all these footprints, and he walked round and round. And each time he walked round, he unravelled another set of footprints. And eventually, when he'd unravelled enough of them, he found the child's. And then he followed it out. And he came back a few hours later with the child. And the woman told me how this old black fella told her that a dingo had taken Azaria Chamberlain. And I think Azaria Chamberlain, if you want one story about contemporary Australia and our relationship with Aboriginal people, Azaria Chamberlain is a very good story to tell. After that time when I was at Kirikara, I went to Uluru a number of times and went to Mutijulu, the Aboriginal community that's at the base. And I started asking around, you know, did you think a dingo took Azaria Chamberlain? Oh yeah, a dingo took Azaria Chamberlain. And a friend of mine's a fellow called Shane Howard who wrote Solid Rock, a song about Uluru. He knows a lot about Uluru. He knows, of all the white fellas I know, he would be one of the 2 or 3 who knows most about Aboriginal culture. And what makes Shane special is he's linked up Indigenous Australian culture with Indigenous Irish culture. And he did a big concert at the Victorian Arts Centre at one of the Melbourne festivals where he had 10 or 15 traditional Irish musicians, 10 or 15 traditional Aboriginal musicians, and put them on together. And I was lucky enough to be part of that. And afterwards, we went to the Quiet Man, a pub in Kensington, and they had a session, what the Irish musicians call a session. These 30 musicians, black fellas, white fellas, didgers, clapping sticks, box accordions, guitars, bodhrans, and they played for about 5 or 6 hours. I remember going home in a taxi with the Pigram brothers from Broome. Stephen Pigram was playing a song called Nowhere Else But Here, and the taxi driver was Lebanese. And I thought, this is one of my great Melbourne moments. But it was Shane Howard who told me that Uluru's got a dingo dreaming that comes in from the west, travels across, and it's a violent story. And in that dingo dreaming is the knowledge that dingoes will take human babies. So that means the knowledge had been around Uluru for thousands of years that dingoes would take human babies. And then I started reading more about the Azaria Chamberlain story. And what's remarkable about it is that in the first 24 hours, no one doubted that a dingo had taken the baby, because that was the local knowledge. That was the local intelligence. And then journalists flew in from all around Australia. And because I'm a journalist, I know how it works. And what happened when those journalists flew in from all around Australia? They answered to news desks in Adelaide, in Sydney, in Melbourne, in white metropolitan areas. And I spent my journalism career basically rebelling against the authority structures within journalism. And people know me as a footy writer, but one of the great things footy writing did for me was it gave me an audience. And once I had an audience, I got freer and freer until in the end I could do what I liked. But for journalists who didn't have that, once they answered to those white news desks in the cities, the white news desks told the journalists what the story was, and at that point it ceased to be an Aboriginal story and became a white story, and at that point Lindy Chamberlain went from being a mother whose child had been stolen by a dingo to a white witch, for which she was convicted of murder. She also said one of the smartest things I ever heard about human nature. She said, When big things happen, people want an explanation. If you don't give them one, they'll make it up. So, I want to tell you another dingo story, this time in Alice Springs. We came back to live here in Tasmania in 2020. Just before we came, I was back in Alice Springs. We went to a town camp that had been described by the Australian newspaper as the most violent place in Australia. And this group had put in an arts centre there. And outside the town centre and the arts centre, the town camp and the arts centre, was this giant rock, the size of a small house. And the rock was really smooth and shiny, looked like it was wet. It was just this big chunk of rock or stone. And that's when I learned that Alice Springs has got a dingo dreaming. Someone told me that the dingo dreaming in Alice Springs connects with the dingo dreaming in Uluru. I don't know if that's true, but that's what I was told. Anyway, the dingo story, and it came from the hill up behind us. And up on that hill was a giant dingo, Dreamtime story dingo. He was giant dingo. And another giant dingo came into the area that is now Alice Springs. And they fought this huge fight. And that big shiny stone that I saw, that's the guts of the dingo that lost the fight. And when you spend a lot of time with Aboriginal people and start to hear these stories, you realise the land was one big theatre. And there were stories everywhere. And everything was part of the story, every creature and every person. But because it's invisible, the Whitefellas came and saw nothing. And so when I came back to Tasmania to live, and I got a wonderful friend called Gordon Cuff who lives at Lilydale. He'd read what I'd written while I'd been away. He knew the journey I'd been on. And he said to me, "You've got to meet Aunty Patsy Cameron." And when I met Patsy in her kitchen at Tomahawk, she said to me, "What do you want from me?" And I said, "I want you to tell me stories of the land for Tasmania, because that's what drives me nuts about this place. We've had a shack for 20 years down at Great Oyster Bay, and I'd look across at the hazards. There's no way there's not stories in there." And one of the remarkable things about that book, Tonga, which Nicholas Clemens wrote with Henry Reynolds, the story in that really got me was when Tonga, who's basically the crazy horse of the Tasmanian War of Resistance, when he's in the last group of free blackfellas in the bush, and there's only maybe a dozen of them, 20 of them, and his woman, his wife, gets pregnant, and that's the last freeborn baby in that period of Tasmanian Aboriginal history. He tried to get back to the hazards. He wanted the baby born in the hazards. And certainly in Central Australia, where babies born relates to their stories. And according to the Tonga, the book, the whitefellas set up an armed guard to stop them getting in. You could write an opera about that. On the last visit to Alice Springs, I went out on country with an Aranda woman elder. We were sitting in a valley with an orange rock face on the other side and a dried up riverbed. The Whitefella name for the place was Hale River. The Aranda woman elder told me the blackfella name for the place, but obviously I can't repeat that because it's not within the range of my mouth to even begin to pronounce it. But I was told the meaning of the name. It was the sound of a stick breaking beneath a man's foot. And it wasn't just any man. It was the Kadachi man. Now, I started by telling you that story about Yundamu when I saw the fear that accompanied the Kadachi man. As I understand it, no one gets to see the Kadachi man. No one gets to hear him. No one knows who he is. But what happened here in that valley, they heard the Kadachi man coming. They heard a stick break. And that story had been there for who knows how long. Thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So I sat there and I could imagine the sound of the broken stick in that valley. And that connected me to the place. Not as someone who has countless ancestors buried there, but as one who has some understanding of a drama that happened there and carried through eons of time to my ear. Without knowing that story, I would have felt like a stranger and out of place to some degree. Because of it, I feel connected. When I try and explain the term sacred site, which after all is a white term, to white fellas, I use the example of Anzac Cove at dawn every Anzac Day. Every year I hear young Australians saying, it's as if they're here, meaning dead Australian soldiers. And here in Australia we hear that and we're reverent to it. We accept it. We respect it. Anzac Cove is an Australian sacred site. To me, the word means places of memory. The difference is that I know the Anzac story and I've heard about it since I was a child. I don't know most Australian Aboriginal stories, and the place I knew least was Tasmania, my home state, the place I'm from. So that's why I wrote Trouwerner with Aunty Patsy. Trouwerner is the name Patsy's people used for Tasmania. And can I just say in passing, Patsy Cameron is a Tasmanian treasure. I cannot thank her enough for welcoming me to country back here in Tasmania. I'm going to finish with one final story, a Tasmanian story. When I was in Victoria, and I'd been there about 10 years, and I'd had quite a few adventures in Northern Australia, and we'd come back here to Tasmania on holiday, and we'd fly over Bass Strait, and the great seal colonies aren't there anymore. And then going to Hobart, and the whales aren't in the Derwent River. And then this is the only place in Australia where Aboriginal people were thought to be extinct for over 100 years. And I said to Dodson, when I go back to Tasmania, I feel absence. What should I do? And he said, look for presence. So I told my brother Tim, who's here today, and Tim's a can-do sort of fella. So he says to me, we're going to go looking for the Tasmanian tiger cock. And so I come down and he's done all the the research, and the last one was shot at Morbana, wasn't it? Yeah, Morbana. And 1934, I think, off the top of my head, or 32. And stories are always strongest in the place they're from. Aboriginal principle, Whitefella principle, all the same. If you really want to feel a story, go to the place it happens. So we went to the place where this last one was shot. And it was seen skulking around a hen house. That's where we stood. I went back to Melbourne and Tim gives me a ring. And he says, he's treating an old bloke from Morbana. He says to him, I was there that day. They shot the last Tasmanian tiger. And he had a photo of it. And he said to Tim, would your brother like the photo? And Tim said, yeah, I'm sure he would. So he sent it to me, but the old bloke had worked up on the Murray River for a time in his youth. And he'd been ploughing a paddock and he pulled up this Aboriginal axe. And he gave me that as well. And I knew it was good. I knew it was a really good example of one. And then I had a fella start my house called Neil Murray, who wrote My Island Home, and he lived for a long time at Papunya in the Northern Territory. And he knows a lot more than I do. And he looked at it, he said, that's a really good axe. And I had a relationship with an Aboriginal man up on the Murray River. We had quite a few adventures together, me and this fella, including we nearly got arrested at Parliament House in Victoria. But one night, when I'd had a few drinks, I looked at this axe and I thought, nah. So I rang him up and I said, I think I've got something that belongs to you. And I told him about the axe. And I said, I'll bring it up to you. He lived at Shepparton. And so I caught the train up. And he and I, we'd had a lot of great talks. And I'd said how hard it was growing up in Tasmania because I didn't know any Aboriginal people. I'd had a few adventures and my first footy hero was Gypsy Lee, who was a descendant of Manalagenna. But I particularly didn't know any elders. I didn't have anyone I could go and ask questions to. And he got it. He got all that. He understood it. Anyway, so I got up there with this Aboriginal axe and he picked me up in a car. We headed off and we drove off. And I don't know where we went. I didn't know. I don't know. I never managed to master Victorian geography, but we headed northwest. And eventually we came to an area, and I think it was a national park. And we got out, we climbed this hill and it has huge boulders. And this was a man who was reverent to his culture. Like, there are Aboriginal people who are devoutly Aboriginal. Michael Long is, Patrick Dodson is, Aunty Patsy is, Nick is. And this man was. And he was taking me to the initiation place of his people. That's huge, because that's when meaning is really concentrated. And that's when you cross this threshold, because traditional Aboriginal culture is a secret society. And that's when you cross the threshold. And it was no longer used, but it would have been used within 100 years. And so when we got there, it was a deeply reverent moment. And at that moment, he looked across and he pointed, and he said, and there's this drawing on the rock. And it was a Tasmanian tiger, which is an absurd word because it wasn't Tasmanian tiger. I call it Lorina, the Northwest Aboriginal name for it. So it was old Lorina. And this was his place, because that creature was all across Australia. And he had dreaming site running through northern Victoria. And it was a really powerful moment. So did I see a Tasmanian tiger? No, I did not. Did I get an enhanced sense of its power and place in the land? Yes, I did. And that gave me an additional sense of belonging and connecting to this place down here. So that story that I've just told you, that's got a real Aboriginal logic. Blackfellas always get that story, which starts with me saying to Dodson, you know, absence. And he goes, look for presents. I'll tell my brother. My brother sets up this Don Quixote-like project for us, and yet that's how it ends up. So those are some of the stories I'd like to tell you. So I'm a white fella who has benefited from my exposure to Aboriginal culture. It doesn't make me love my country less. It makes me love my country more. And I am not ashamed of my ancestors. And people who say, welcome to the country, it means, of course you're born here. But it goes back to that thing I said about England. You really only want to know the history of this land back to 1770. I want to know the lot. And I believe I'm a richer person because of that. Thank you very much.
Martin, thank you very, very much.